I came back from my business trip and walked into my own house, only to find my entire family waiting for me. My son looked me in the eye and said, "Mom, your time is over. Dad is happier with her." No shouting, no explanations, no apologies. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I turned around, walked away in silence, and let them believe they had won. What they didn't know was that my silence wasn't surrender. It was the beginning of the worst mistake they would ever make. That I had imagined my return 100 different ways during that flight. Fatigue softened reunions, the familiar comfort of my own walls, the quiet relief of slipping back into routine after weeks of negotiations in airports and hotel rooms that all smelled the same. I hadn't imagined this. Not the stillness. Not the way the house felt staged, like a set prepared for a scene I hadn't been given the script for. The door clicked shut behind me, and I knew immediately something was wrong. The air was heavy, expectant, too quiet. I took 2 steps forward, and then I saw them. All of them. My husband, my son, my sister-in-law, even my mother-in-law, seated neatly on the sofa, as if this were a formal gathering instead of an ambush. No one smiled. My suitcase rolled to a stop beside my leg. For a brief moment, no one spoke. They were waiting for me to react, to fill the silence with confusion or fear. I didn't. I looked at each face slowly, registering the strange mixture of resolve and discomfort, the way people look when they've rehearsed something cruel and are bracing themselves to deliver it. My husband stood first. He didn't come toward me. He stayed where he was, as if distance might protect him. "We need to talk," he said, his voice already defensive. Before I could respond, my son stepped forward. That was the part that hurt the most. He didn't look uncertain. He didn't look conflicted. He looked instructed, like someone who had been given a role and practiced it until it felt convincing. He lifted his chin slightly, meeting my eyes with an expression that felt rehearsed rather than felt. "Mom," he said clearly, "your time is over. Dad is happier with her." The words landed cleanly, without hesitation. Someone had made sure of that. For a fraction of a second, I felt the familiar instinct rise, the urge to explain, to ask questions, to defend myself against a verdict I hadn't known was being debated. Years of habit tried to assert themselves. Years of smoothing conflict, of mediating, of absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to. And then something else took over. Stillness. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and realized he had already made his choice. Or rather, it had been made for him, and he had accepted it because it was easier than questioning the people standing beside him. I looked at my husband and saw not guilt, but relief. Relief that he wasn't the one speaking the hardest line. No one asked how my trip went. No one asked if I was tired. No one asked if I wanted to sit down. This wasn't a conversation. It was a declaration. I nodded once. Not an agreement. An acknowledgement. "I see," I said quietly. The reaction was immediate and confused. This wasn't what they expected. My mother-in-law shifted uncomfortably. My sister-in-law avoided my eyes. My husband frowned slightly, as if my calm had disrupted the order of events. "That's it?" he asked. "You're not going to say anything?" I picked up my suitcase. "I don't have anything to say," I replied. "You've already said it for me." I turned and walked toward the door. Not quickly, not dramatically. Each step deliberate, measured. I felt their eyes on my back, felt the tension spike as they realized something was off. This wasn't surrender. It wasn't collapse. It was withdrawal. "Where are you going?" my husband called after me. I paused at the door and looked back once. "Somewhere I'm not being replaced," I said calmly. Then I left. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't scream. I didn't call anyone. I drove until the house disappeared from my mirrors, until the noise in my head quieted enough for me to think clearly. Shock has a way of sharpening focus if you let it. That was when I understood the truth I'd been avoiding for years. I hadn't lost my family in one evening. I had been losing them slowly, quietly, while I was busy holding everything together. My absence hadn't created the betrayal. It had simply given it space to reveal itself. And as I pulled over, turned off the engine, and sat alone for the first time in what felt like forever, one thought settled with absolute certainty. If they believed my silence meant defeat, They were about to learn how wrong they were that I didn't go far that night. Distance wasn't the point. Clarity was. I checked into a small hotel on the edge of the city, the kind designed for people passing through rather than settling in. The anonymity felt right. No one knew me there. No one expected anything from me. I set my suitcase down, closed the door, and finally allowed myself to sit still. Only then did the shock fully surface. Not as tears, not as panic, as inventory. I replayed the scene with precision, not emotion. The way my son had spoken, the way my husband had stayed silent while letting him do it. The presence of extended family, positioned like witnesses to legitimize what was happening. It hadn't been spontaneous. It had been staged. That realization mattered more than the betrayal itself. Staged meant planned. Planned meant calculated. And calculated mistakes could be reversed. I took out my phone. There were already messages waiting. Missed calls. A few texts from my husband, each more irritated than concerned. Where did you go? We need to talk like adults. You're overreacting. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't care, because responding too early would give them information they didn't deserve. They thought the silence meant I was processing, hurting, retreating. They were wrong. By the next morning, the narrative had already begun forming without me. I could feel it. I knew how families worked when they closed ranks. I was being recast as the obstacle, the absence, the problem that had finally been removed so happiness could resume. My calm exit had been interpreted as concession, permission. I let them have that illusion. I spent the day doing very little outwardly. I ate slowly. I walked. I watched people who had nothing to do with my life move freely through their own. That normalcy anchored me. It reminded me that my world had not ended. It had simply narrowed for a moment, and narrowing brings focus. Late in the afternoon, I made the first call that mattered. Not to confront, to confirm. I spoke to someone I trusted professionally, framing my questions carefully. Hypotheticals, scenarios, possibilities. I didn't need drama. I needed information. What I learned confirmed what I had already suspected. The structure of my life, the assets, the authority, the legal positioning was not as fragile as they believed. In fact, much of what they assumed was shared was not. It had simply been treated that way out of habit. Habit is dangerous when people confuse it for entitlement. By evening, the calls from home escalated. My son left a message. His voice was tense, unsure. "Mom, Dad says you're not answering. You need to come back so we can talk." Not concern, expectation, as if my return were given, delayed, but inevitable. I didn't call back. Instead, I opened my laptop and began organizing. Not emotionally, logistically, documents, accounts, records, the invisible framework that had supported our lives quietly for years. I knew it intimately because I had helped build it. I had just never asserted ownership over it. That was changing. While they were sitting together in my house, likely congratulating themselves on their honesty, I was mapping out contingencies. Not revenge, protection. If they had been willing to ambush me as a group, to weaponize my child's voice, then I could no longer assume good faith in anything that followed. Trust, once broken publicly, does not deserve private repair. I slept that night for the first time in days without waking. The decision to stop engaging had freed something in me. In the morning, there were more messages. Angrier now, less controlled. My husband accused me of being dramatic. My sister-in-law texted that everyone was worried, that I was making things worse by disappearing. I didn't disappear. I relocated my attention. They believed the worst was over because I had left quietly. They believed silence was surrender because that was how they would have behaved if the roles were reversed. They were projecting their own limitations onto me. By the time they realized I wasn't coming back on their timeline, the balance had already shifted, and they hadn't even noticed yet. The third day was when their confidence began to falter. Up until then, they had operated on the assumption that my absence was temporary. A pause, a dramatic retreat designed to elicit guilt or apology. They expected me to return once the initial shock wore off, once the silence grew uncomfortable enough to pull me back into the familiar role of mediator and absorber. I didn't. That was when the tone of the messages changed. My husband's calls stopped entirely, replaced by carefully worded texts. We need to discuss logistics. This can't go on indefinitely. He was shifting from authority to administration, and that told me more than anger ever could. People don't talk about logistics unless the situation is no longer unfolding according to plan. My son stopped calling after a second unanswered voicemail. Instead, he sent a short message. Mom, this is getting weird. Not remorse. Confusion. The certainty he'd been coached into was already thinning. Good. I spent that day finalizing something I had quietly delayed for years. A separation of responsibilities that had always existed in theory, but never in execution. I contacted the people who actually mattered, the ones who understood the framework of our shared life without emotional investment in the narrative my family was spinning. No accusations, no explanations, just updates. By the time I checked out of the hotel and moved into a temporary apartment, everything was in motion. Nothing flashy, nothing illegal, just a reassertion of boundaries that had been blurred by convenience and misplaced trust. That evening, my phone rang. My husband. I answered this time. Where are you? He asked immediately. I'm safe, I replied. That's not what I asked. I know, I said calmly. There was a pause. I could hear him recalibrating, trying to regain footing. This isn't how adults handle things, he said. I smiled faintly. Neither is staging an intervention without the person you're intervening against. You walked out on your family, he snapped. No, I corrected him. I walked away from a decision you had already made. That silenced him. He exhaled sharply. You're making this harder than it needs to be. No, I said again. I'm making it accurate. His voice dropped. You can't just disappear. There are things you're responsible for. I waited a beat before answering. We're going to need to redefine what I'm responsible for. That was the moment he realized something fundamental had shifted. Not emotionally, structurally. He tried to recover, tried to appeal to routine, to normalcy, to the life we had built together. But routine only works when everyone agrees to keep performing it. I think you should come home, he said finally. I don't, I replied. After that, the conversation ended quickly. He had nothing left to say that didn't rely on authority he no longer had. When the call disconnected, I felt no rush of emotion, just confirmation. Later that night, my mother-in-law called. I let it ring. Then she texted, This isn't fair to your son. There it was, the lever they always pulled. The implication that my self-preservation was cruelty, that any boundary I set would inevitably harm the child they had already placed between us. I typed my response carefully. What isn't fair is asking him to deliver messages that should have come from his father. There was no reply. The next morning, I received an email from my husband's lawyer. That was the second crack. They had escalated from family pressure to formal channels far sooner than I expected. That told me they were nervous. Nervous people rush. Rush decisions create mistakes. The email was polite, neutral, and revealing. It asked about temporary arrangements and shared assets. It assumed access. It assumed continuity. It assumed compliance. I forwarded it to my own attorney with a single line, It's starting. By noon, the illusion they had been operating under was unraveling. Slowly, quietly, in ways they couldn't yet articulate, but could already feel. They had believed my silence meant I was processing their decision. In reality, I had been preparing to dismantle the foundation it rested on. They expected resistance to look loud. Raised voices, emotional outbursts, ultimatums delivered through tears. That was the version of conflict they understood, the one they could manage. Loud resistance could be reframed as instability. Emotion could be dismissed as weakness. It would have allowed them to tighten ranks and justify what they'd done. What they weren't prepared for was absence paired with precision. The first sign that I wasn't coming back came in the form of a practical inconvenience. One of the household accounts, one I had always overseen quietly, required authorization for renewal. It didn't renew. The charge declined without drama, without warning. A small thing, easily overlooked until it wasn't. Then another. Then another. Nothing catastrophic. Just enough friction to disrupt the rhythm of a house that had functioned smoothly for years because someone else had been making sure it did. That someone had been me. My husband called again, his tone sharper than before. There's a problem with the accounts, he said. Yes, I replied. You need to fix it. I don't, I said calmly. I need to decide what I'm responsible for. That's ridiculous, he snapped. You can't just stop doing things. I didn't stop, I replied. I stepped away. He laughed, short and incredulous. This is petty. No, I said. This is accurate. He hung up on me. That night, my son called. Not to apologize. Not to ask how I was. To complain. Mom, the internet's been out all day, he said. Dad says it's because you didn't pay something. I closed my eyes briefly. Not in pain. In recognition. I didn't forget to pay, I said. I stopped managing it. There was a long pause. So, are you going to fix it? No, I replied gently. That's something your father can handle. But I always did a lot of things, I interrupted softly. That doesn't mean they were my obligation. He didn't know how to respond to that. I could hear the confusion in his breathing. The world he understood had rules, and those rules depended on my invisible labor. Without it, nothing made sense. That confusion was not cruelty. It was reality catching up. By the end of the week, they were no longer framing my absence as emotional. They were framing it as disruptive. That shift mattered. Disruption meant consequences. Consequences meant accountability. And accountability had never been part of their plan. The lawyer emails grew more frequent, more urgent, less polite. They wanted meetings. They wanted clarification. They wanted me back in the room where decisions could be steered, where pressure could be applied in familiar ways. I declined every request, responding only through my attorney. Not to escalate, to formalize. Formalization terrifies people who rely on ambiguity. I learned later that they'd begun arguing among themselves. My husband blamed my sister-in-law for encouraging him. She blamed my mother-in-law for pushing too hard. Everyone blamed me for overreacting. No one took responsibility for orchestrating a scene that had treated me as expendable. The fracture lines were forming. I remained where I was, quietly establishing my independence. I updated records, redirected responsibilities, separated systems that had never truly belonged to anyone but me. Each action was small on its own. Together, they were irreversible. The house I had left behind was beginning to feel the absence of its stabilizer. Meals were missed, appointments forgotten. Small crises became exhausting because no one was smoothing them out in advance. The woman they had replaced me with, because there was always a her, was not interested in managing logistics. She had been invited for companionship, not responsibility. That realization hit them hard. By the time my husband finally said the words out loud, "She's not stepping in the way you did," it was already too late. I wasn't coming back to fill gaps. I had already moved beyond the life that required me to that. It didn't take long for the illusion to collapse. They had believed replacing me would be simple. That presence was interchangeable. That warmth could be swapped without consequence. That the role I had played for years, organizer, buffer, problem solver, emotional shock absorber, was something anyone could step into if given access to the house and the title. They were wrong. The first cracks appeared quietly, not as arguments, but as omissions. Missed school deadlines, forgotten appointments, dinners that happened late or not at all. The kind of details that never made headlines but held a family together. The kind of details I had carried so effortlessly that no one had ever thought to notice. The woman my husband had chosen wasn't cruel. She wasn't incompetent. She was simply uninterested in becoming invisible. She wanted appreciation, not responsibility. Presence, not maintenance. And very quickly, she realized she had stepped into a life that demanded far more than affection. My son noticed before anyone else. He called one evening, his voice uncertain. "Mom, where do you keep the insurance stuff?" "I don't," I replied. "Your father knows. He says you always handled it." "I did," I said gently. "When I lived there." Silence followed. Not angry, unsettled. The next day, my husband called again. This time, there was no accusation in his voice. Just strain. "She's overwhelmed," he said. "This is all new to her." I didn't respond right away. "That's understandable," I said finally. "It was new to me once, too." He sighed. "You're doing this on purpose." "No," I said calmly. "I'm not doing anything. I'm not there." That distinction frustrated him more than confrontation ever could have. He wanted something to push against, something to blame. But absence gave you nothing to fight except your own expectations. The truth was simple and brutal. They hadn't replaced me. They had removed me. And removal doesn't come with a substitute by default. The woman he was happier with began spending less time at the house. Not dramatically, gradually. She had commitments elsewhere. Friends, a life that didn't revolve around managing someone else's chaos. Each departure left my husband more exposed to the reality he had helped create. My son grew quieter. His messages shifted from expectation to confusion, then from confusion to discomfort. He began asking questions that had no good answers. Why did things feel harder now? Why did everyone seem tired? Why was Dad angry all the time? I didn't answer those questions directly. I didn't need to. Experience was teaching him faster than I ever could. By the end of the month, the family gatherings stopped. My mother-in-law stopped calling. My sister-in-law sent a single message that said, "We didn't think it would turn out like this." I didn't reply. There was nothing to add. They had created a scenario that depended entirely on my absence remaining passive. Instead, my absence was active. Every system I had once supported without recognition now required action. Every shortcut I had taken to keep peace now demanded effort. The emotional labor they had dismissed as just being mom revealed its true weight once it was gone. And the worst part for them was that there was no one to blame but themselves. They had watched me walk away and assumed the silence meant I would return once things became uncomfortable, that I would resume my place out of love, out of obligation, out of habit. They didn't understand that walking away had not been an emotional reaction. It had been a decision. And decisions, once acted on, do not beg to be reversed. As I sat in my quiet apartment one evening, reviewing plans for the next phase of my life, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction, not vindication, but certainty. The kind that settles in your bones when you finally stop carrying weight that was never meant to be yours alone. They had wanted a future without me. Now, they were learning what that actually meant. The shift didn't happen all at once. It never does when belief systems collapse. It begins with discomfort, then confusion, and finally doubt. And doubt is dangerous when it's aimed in the wrong direction. My son didn't call for days after the last conversation. That silence was different from before. It wasn't avoidance. It was processing. I recognized it immediately because I had lived in that space myself for years, quietly reconciling what I was told with what I was experiencing. When he finally did call, his voice was careful. "Mom," he said, "can I ask you something?" "Yes," I replied. "Did you really give up on us?" The question wasn't accusatory. It was searching. He was trying to fit reality into the story he'd been handed, and it wasn't working anymore. "I didn't give up," I said gently. "I stepped away from something that had already ended without my consent." He was quiet for a moment. "Dad says you left because you couldn't accept that he moved on." I didn't correct him immediately. Children deserve space to arrive at truth without having it weaponized. "Do you believe that?" I asked instead. Another pause. Longer this time. "I don't know," he admitted. "Things are different now." Different was an understatement. He told me about missed meals, about arguments that started over nothing and spiraled, about the woman his father was happier with who didn't like being corrected, didn't like being expected to manage things she hadn't agreed to, about how the house felt tense all the time now, like everyone was waiting for something to go wrong. And when something does, he added quietly, "Dad gets mad. Like it's my fault." I closed my eyes briefly. "I'm sorry you're experiencing that," I said. "That isn't fair to you. But you could fix it," he said, almost pleading. "You always knew how." There it was. The belief they had all shared. That my competence existed as a safety net they could stretch indefinitely. "I could help," I said carefully. "But fixing it would mean pretending nothing happened. And that wouldn't be honest." He didn't respond right away. "You're not coming back, are you?" he asked finally. "No," I said softly. "I'm not." The finality in my voice landed differently than anger ever could have. It forced him to confront a reality he hadn't wanted to consider. That the version of our family he remembered depended entirely on my unacknowledged labor and emotional restraint. And once that was gone, there was no way to recreate it by force. After that call, something changed in how he spoke to me. The expectation faded, the entitlement with it. In its place was uncertainty and something else, awareness. He started asking different questions. Not, when are you coming back, but how did you do everything? Not, why did you leave, but were you unhappy? Those questions weren't easy to answer, but they were honest. And honesty was something he had not been given when they'd staged that moment in the living room and asked him to deliver a verdict that wasn't his to make. Meanwhile, my husband grew increasingly agitated. The absence of resolution gnawed at him. He wanted a reset, a version of events where I returned quietly, resentful but compliant, restoring balance without challenging the narrative he had built. That version no longer existed. He called one evening, his voice sharp with frustration. "You're turning him against me." "No," I replied. "I'm not controlling what he sees anymore." "You're being selfish," he snapped. "You're choosing yourself over your family." "Yes," I said calmly. "And that doesn't make me wrong." He hung up without another word. I sat in the quiet afterward, thinking about how often women are taught that choosing themselves is abandonment, while everyone else's choices are framed as necessity. I had internalized that lesson for too long. Now, I was unlearning in real time. My son would eventually understand, or he wouldn't. Either way, I could no longer sacrifice my dignity to maintain a structure that had already collapsed. They had turned my silence into a declaration of defeat. Instead, it had become the space where truth finally entered that IT was never going to stay contained. When systems collapse, they don't fail politely. They ripple. The house they had reclaimed in my absence began to push back in ways no one could ignore anymore. Not metaphorically, literally. Repairs piled up, small ones at first. A leak that should have been handled early. An appliance that stopped working because no one remembered the maintenance schedule. The kind of things I had quietly tracked for years, fixing before they became disruptions. Without that vigilance, inconvenience turned into cost. My husband complained about it constantly, to anyone who would listen, that things were falling apart, that nothing worked the way it used to. He said it like the house itself had betrayed him. He never once asked why. The woman he was happier with stopped staying overnight. She said she needed her space, that the energy in the house felt heavy, that she hadn't signed up for this level of responsibility. My husband argued. She withdrew further. Attraction doesn't survive resentment very long. My son noticed. He started spending more time in his room, eating out, avoiding the common areas that had become tense and unpredictable. The house that once felt anchored now felt like a fault line. Everyone walking carefully, no one fixing the source. He called me one afternoon, unprompted. "Mom," he said, "did you know Dad's thinking about selling the house?" I paused. "Why?" "He says it's too much, that it reminds him of things." I understood immediately. He wasn't overwhelmed by the house. He was overwhelmed by what it represented. A life that had functioned because someone else had been absorbing its weight. A reminder that happiness built on removal doesn't hold. "That's his decision," I said. "But if he sells it," my son hesitated, "where will we go?" There was again the assumption that I would step in, that I would anchor whatever uncertainty followed. "I'm not part of that decision anymore," I replied gently. He was quiet for a long time. "You really meant it when you walked out?" "Yes," I said. The house continued to unravel after that. Arguments escalated. The woman left for good after one too many nights of tension and blame. She hadn't expected to inherit a system without instructions. She certainly hadn't expected to be resented for not becoming me. My husband blamed everyone. Her, my son, the circumstances, never himself. That's when the house turned against them completely. Bills missed, penalties applied, a cascade of consequences triggered by neglect. None of it dramatic in isolation, all of it exhausting together. The kind of exhaustion that breaks people not through crisis, but through accumulation. That I heard about it not because I asked, but because silence invites confession. People talk when the person they once controlled is no longer participating. They talk because they want relief. I didn't offer it. My life, in contrast, was stabilizing in ways that felt almost unfair. Not because I had escaped hardship, but because I had stopped carrying hardship that wasn't mine alone. My energy returned. My focus sharpened. I stopped waking up braced for conflict. One evening, as I sat reviewing plans for the next year, I realized something important. I hadn't turned their lives into a living hell. I had simply removed myself from being the one who prevented it. And once that happened, the truth of their choices revealed itself. That'd be why the time spring arrived, the story had changed again. Not because anyone rewrote it deliberately, but because reality has a way of correcting false narratives without asking permission. The version where I was the problem no longer held up under pressure. Too many things had gone wrong. Too many gaps had appeared. Too many people were now tired in ways that could not be blamed on my absence alone. My husband stopped pretending everything was fine. The complaints turned into admissions. He began telling people he was overwhelmed, that he hadn't realized how much I'd handled, that things had slipped through the cracks. The cracks, of course, were everywhere. Finance, scheduling, emotional stability. The scaffolding I had built quietly over years had been removed, and what remained could not stand on intention alone. What struck me most was how often he framed it as confusion. "I don't know how it all fell apart so fast," he said to someone we both knew. It hadn't been fast. It had been gradual. He just hadn't been the one holding it together. My son felt the consequences more acutely than anyone else, and that was the part that hurt, even as I knew I had made the right choice. He moved between frustration and guilt, trying to reconcile loyalty with lived experience. He started asking practical questions instead of emotional ones. How things worked, why things mattered, what happened when no one stepped in. Those questions told me everything. He was learning. One evening, he called and said quietly, "Dad's angry all the time now." I didn't respond immediately. "He wasn't like this before," my son continued. Or maybe he was. I just didn't see it. That realization wasn't mine to manage. It was his to process. "I'm sorry you're dealing with that," I said. "You don't deserve to carry it. But if you were here," I stopped him gently. "I can't fix what I didn't break." The silence that followed wasn't defensive. It was understanding arriving slowly. Meanwhile, the extended family stopped reaching out entirely. The moral certainty they'd worn so confidently that first night had eroded. People are quick to judge when they believe consequences will be borne by someone else. Once those consequences began touching them, their voices quieted. No apologies came. I didn't expect any. I also didn't intervene when the inevitable happened. When my husband finally admitted that he couldn't manage everything on his own, when he began asking for help, not reconciliation, not love, but relief, someone to step back into the role I had vacated. "I just need things to stabilize," he said during one call. For him, "I understand wanting stability for our son," I replied. "But stability built on me erasing myself isn't stability. It's dependency." That was the conversation where it finally clicked for him. Not emotionally, logically. He went quiet, then said something I hadn't expected. "I didn't think you would actually stay gone. I didn't think you would actually replace me," I replied. Neither of us had prepared for the other to follow through. After that, the calls stopped again. This time, they didn't resume. What replaced them was consequence. Undeniable, unnegotiable, the kind that doesn't ask for understanding or forgiveness. It simply arrives and demands adaptation. I adapted. They struggled. And in that contrast, something important became clear, not just to me, but to everyone watching quietly from the sidelines. I hadn't destroyed anything. I had stepped out of a system that only functioned when I absorbed its cost. Once that cost became visible, there was nothing left to argue about. The turning point came quietly, without confrontation or announcement. It always does when something truly ends. There was no argument, no dramatic phone call, no final declaration of independence. There was simply a moment when I realized that nothing inside me was pulling me back anymore. Before, even after everything, there had been a faint tether. Not hope, habit, the instinct to check in, to anticipate needs, to stay available in case things fell apart badly enough to require intervention. That instinct had been shaped over years of being the one who stabilized crises before they became visible. It had kept me tied to a life that no longer existed. That tether dissolved the day my son stopped asking me to fix things. He called that afternoon, his voice steady in a way it hadn't been for months. I figured out how to handle the school forms, he said. It took a while, but I did it. That's good, I replied. And I meant it. He didn't ask for validation. He didn't complain. He didn't ask if I was coming back. He was reporting progress, not appealing for rescue. That distinction mattered more than anything else he could have said. After he hung up, I sat quietly for a long time, letting the weight of that moment settle. He was adapting, not because things were easier, but because they had to be. And in adapting, he was learning something I had learned far too late. That competence grows when it's required, not when it's assumed someone else will step in. Later that week, I received an email from my husband. Not accusatory, not pleading, just factual. He was selling the house, downsizing, restructuring his life to fit what he could actually manage. There was no mention of me returning, no invitation, no resentment, just acknowledgement. That was when I knew it was permanent. He had stopped seeing my absence as temporary disruption and started treating it as a fixed condition. People don't restructure their lives unless they've accepted that something fundamental has changed. Acceptance doesn't always come with humility. Sometimes it arrives disguised as practicality. I felt no triumph reading that email. No sadness either. Just clarity. The life we had built together had depended on an unspoken arrangement. I would absorb complexity so others could move comfortably. Once I withdrew from that role, the structure couldn't be sustained. Not because I was irreplaceable, but because no one else wanted the cost that came with it. That realization freed me in a way nothing else had. I stopped monitoring their situation altogether. Not out of spite, but because my attention was no longer needed there. The energy I had once devoted to anticipating problems now flowed into my own future. Planning became expansive rather than defensive. I thought in years again, not weeks. I made decisions without factoring in reactions I would never have to manage. I accepted opportunities without negotiating my own presence down to accommodate someone else's comfort. I began to trust that I didn't need to be useful to be worthy of space. That shift was subtle but profound. One evening, while reviewing long-term plans with my advisor, I caught myself smiling. Not because everything was perfect, but because everything was honest. My resources matched my responsibilities. My commitments aligned with my values. There was no hidden labor, no unacknowledged sacrifice underpinning my stability. That was when I understood the true cost of the life I had left behind. It wasn't the betrayal. It wasn't the ambush. It was the years I'd spent believing that being essential meant being valued. The two are not the same. Being essential often just means you're convenient to overlook. By walking away, I had forced everyone, including myself, to confront that truth. My son would continue to learn. My husband would continue to adjust. The family would find a new equilibrium that did not include my silent labor. That was not cruelty. It was consequence. And for the first time since I returned from that business trip and found my life waiting to be dismantled in my own living room, I felt something settle that I hadn't felt in a very long time. Completion. Peace didn't arrive the way I expected it to. I had imagined it as relief, as rest after exhaustion, as the absence of noise. Instead, it arrived as strength. Quiet, steady, unmovable. The kind of strength that doesn't need to prove itself because it already knows its limits. I noticed it one morning while reviewing my schedule. There was nothing urgent, nothing reactive. No appointments built around other people's needs. No reminders to fix problems that weren't mine. The absence of chaos was no longer strange. It was normal. That was when I realized they couldn't take this from me anymore. For months, my husband had tried to regain control in small ways. Through guilt, through implication, through the unspoken belief that motherhood meant self-erasure. But each attempt failed, not because I resisted, but because there was nothing left for him to grip. Control only works when someone stays within reach. I wasn't. My son sensed the change too. Our conversations shifted again, this time toward neutrality. Not blame, not loyalty tests, just updates, observations, shared moments that didn't ask me to intervene or rescue. We spoke like two people learning to understand each other again, without the weight of expectation crushing the space between us. One evening, he said quietly, "You seem different." "I am," I replied. "Better." I thought for a moment. "More honest," I said. He nodded slowly, as if filing that away for later understanding. I learned not to rush his process. Children don't unlearn narratives overnight, especially when those narratives were reinforced by the people they trusted most. What mattered was that I was no longer sacrificing myself to correct them. I was present without being consumable. That balance changed everything. Meanwhile, the extended family stopped pretending they had moral authority. The silence from them was not peacemaking. It was retreat. They had witnessed the consequences unfold and realized they had no clean way to defend their involvement. Judgment is easy when it carries no cost. Once it does, people disappear. I didn't miss them. I began to rebuild my life in visible ways now. Not loudly, just openly. I took on projects I had postponed for years. I reconnected with parts of myself that had been sidelined in the effort to keep others comfortable. I traveled without explanation. I rested without guilt. The most powerful realization came unexpectedly during conversation with a colleague. She asked how I'd managed to stay so composed through everything. I answered without thinking. I stopped negotiating my worth. The truth of that settled deeply. For years, my value had been measured by how well I kept things running, how smoothly I absorbed disruption, how effectively I prevented consequences from reaching others. Once I removed myself from that equation, my worth no longer fluctuated based on their comfort. That freedom was intoxicating. I thought back to the moment my son had delivered that line. "Your time is over." He had said it with certainty, believing he was closing a chapter. In reality, he had marked the end of a version of me that no longer existed. My time wasn't over. It was just beginning somewhere they could no longer reach. By the time summer approached, the emotional noise had thinned to a hum so faint it barely registered anymore. The drama had burned itself out, not because anyone had resolved it, but because there was nothing left to react to. Conflict requires participation. I had withdrawn mine completely. That withdrawal forced the truth to surface in places no one could ignore. My husband stopped pretending he was happier. Not publicly, of course. Public happiness is easy to perform. But privately, in the small choices that betray reality, the cracks showed. He stopped making long-term plans. He stopped hosting. He stopped speaking with confidence about the future. The woman he had chosen did not return, not even sporadically. What remained was a man living in the aftermath of his own decisions, adjusting daily to a life that demanded more than he had anticipated. My son saw it before I did. He began to ask questions that had nothing to do with me and everything to do with understanding. Why does Dad get angry when things go wrong? Why does he say you were controlling when you were the one doing everything? Those questions weren't accusations. They were recognition forming. I answered carefully, not defensively, not with bitterness. People sometimes confuse structure with control, I told him, and support with obligation. He was quiet for a long time after that. A week later, he sent me a message I didn't expect. "I didn't know how much you did." I read it twice before responding. "I didn't either," I wrote back. Not until I stopped. That exchange changed something fundamental between us. Not instantly, but permanently. It removed the illusion that I had simply chosen absence. It reframed my departure as consequence rather than abandonment. Meanwhile, the extended family made one last attempt at reconciliation, an invitation framed as concern. "For the sake of peace," they said. I declined politely. Peace built on denial is just silence under pressure. I'd already lived that life. They didn't push. By then, it was clear I wasn't returning to fill gaps or soften outcomes. The version of me they had relied on was gone, and no amount of nostalgia would resurrect her. I spent more time alone that summer than I ever had before, and instead of feeling lonely, I felt spacious. My thoughts were uninterrupted, my choices unfiltered. I learned to enjoy my own company in ways I never had when I was constantly orienting myself around others. One afternoon, While sitting in a cafe, watching people move through their lives, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had fueled my clarity early on, but it was no longer necessary. What replaced it was self-respect. Solid, uncompromising, calm. I didn't need validation or apology. I didn't need acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I needed alignment. And I had it. The truth had settled everywhere it needed to. My husband now lived with the reality he had created. My son was beginning to understand the cost of the story he had been asked to repeat. And I was no longer carrying a life that diminished me. That was enough. There was a quiet moment one evening when I understood that something irreversible had happened. Not in my circumstances, but in me. I was standing in my kitchen, rinsing a glass, when my phone lit up with my husband's name. No urgency, no dread, just a name on a screen that no longer commanded an emotional response. I let it ring, not because I was punishing him, not because I was afraid of what he might say, but because I didn't feel the obligation to answer anymore. That obligation, the reflex to be available, to manage, to absorb, had finally dissolved. That was the version of me that never returned. When I eventually listened to the voicemail, it was short and carefully neutral. He wanted to discuss next steps for our son, school logistics, schedules, things that required coordination but not closeness. I returned the call the next day, handled the details efficiently, and ended the conversation without drifting into emotional territory. He didn't try to push it. He couldn't. The power dynamic had settled into something new. Balanced, limited, appropriate. I noticed how differently I spoke now. Fewer qualifiers. No softening phrases. No over-explaining. I stated what I could do and what I couldn't, and that was enough. Boundaries no longer felt like defenses. They felt like definitions. My son sensed it too. He stopped testing my availability, stopped pushing for emotional labor disguised as concern. When we talked, it was direct, honest, sometimes awkward, always real. He was learning, slowly, that relationships didn't need to be controlled to be meaningful. One evening, he asked, "Do you think things could have been different?" I considered the question carefully. Only if everyone had been willing to see me as a person instead of a role, I said. He nodded, absorbing that. The extended family had gone quiet completely now. No check-ins, no commentary. The absence was telling. People who thrive on moral certainty rarely stay present when that certainty collapses. I didn't miss the noise. What I gained instead was space. Space to think without interruption. Space to choose without justification. Space to exist without being useful. I began to understand how much of my identity had been shaped by service. How often I'd measure my worth by how smoothly things ran around me. Stepping out of that framework didn't make me less valuable. It made me visible to myself. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in a store window and paused. There was a calm there I didn't recognize at first. Not relief, not exhaustion, confidence without performance. The kind that doesn't need to be noticed to exist. I realized then that when I had walked out of that house in silence, I hadn't just left a confrontation. I had left an identity that no longer fit. And once shed, it could not be reclaimed. Not by guilt, not by nostalgia, not by pressure. The woman they had expected to return, the one who smoothed things over, who restored order without asking for accountability, was gone. And she wasn't coming back. What surprised me most in the months that followed was how often I was tempted to explain myself, and how freeing it felt every time I didn't. Old instincts don't disappear overnight. For years, I had been the translator of tension, the clarifier of misunderstandings, the one who stepped in to smooth edges before they cut anyone else. Silence had once felt like negligence. Now it felt like power. People still talked. Of course they did. Stories don't die just because the person at the center stops participating. Some said I had abandoned my family. Others said I had finally snapped. A few claimed I was being manipulated by ambition or pride. I heard fragments of these narratives secondhand, filtered through people who weren't quite brave enough to repeat them directly. I didn't correct a single one, not because they were all false. Some held pieces of truth, but because none of them mattered. Correcting the narrative would have required me to re-enter the space where I had been diminished. It would have meant arguing for understanding from people who had already decided my role. I had outgrown that role. One afternoon, I ran into an old family friend who looked at me with thinly veiled curiosity. "You seem fine," she said, as if searching for cracks. "I am," I replied simply. She hesitated. "I heard things didn't end well." I smiled politely. "Things ended honestly." That was all I said. It was enough. The truth is, silence unsettles people more than defense ever could. When you don't rush to explain yourself, it forces others to sit with their assumptions. Some revise them. Most don't. Either way, it's no longer your responsibility. My son began to notice this too. He told me once, almost sheepishly, that people asked him questions about me. What he said next told me everything. "I don't answer them," he said. "It doesn't feel like my place." That moment mattered more than any apology could have. It meant he was learning something essential. That loyalty doesn't mean performing someone else's story. It means respecting boundaries, even when they're uncomfortable. My husband, on the other hand, struggled deeply with the loss of narrative control. He had always relied on being understood, or at least believed. Without my participation, his explanations rang hollow. They changed too often. They contradicted themselves. People noticed. I didn't need to point it out. Tom did that for me. As my life continued to stabilize, opportunities opened without effort. Not because I chased them, but because clarity attracts alignment. People who value competence and honesty gravitate toward those who embody it quietly. I found myself trusted with more, consulted more, respected without negotiation. That respect felt different than the kind I had known before. It wasn't conditional. It didn't depend on how much I gave. It existed because I knew who I was without needing to prove it. One evening, as I sat reviewing plans for the year ahead, I realized something profound. I no longer wanted justice. I didn't crave acknowledgement of wrongdoing or validation of pain. Those desires had faded, replaced by something far more sustainable. Freedom. Freedom from explanation. Freedom from performance. Freedom from roles I never agreed to play. Walking away in silence had not turned their lives into a living hell. It had simply removed the buffer that kept them from feeling the full weight of their own choices. And in doing so, it had given me a life that no longer required permission to exist. The final transformation didn't come with an announcement. It didn't arrive as triumph or vindication. It came as expansion, quiet, steady, undeniable. A life growing into the space I had reclaimed. By then, I no longer measured time by what had been lost. I measured it by what felt possible. My days were full in a way that didn't exhaust me. I woke with intention instead of obligation. I planned without bracing for interruption. I noticed how easily I breathed now, how rarely my shoulders tensed in anticipation of someone else's dissatisfaction. That constant vigilance, the one I had mistaken for responsibility, was gone. And nothing collapsed because of it. My son adjusted in ways that surprised both of us. Not perfectly, not without struggle, but honestly, he learned to manage discomfort instead of outsourcing it. He learned that authority without accountability fractures quickly. Most importantly, he learned that love does not require self-erasure to survive. One afternoon, he said something that stayed with me. "I don't think I really saw you before." I nodded. That happens when someone is always holding everything together. He didn't argue. My husband faded into the background of my life entirely. Not erased, not demonized, simply no longer central. Our interactions became infrequent, functional, bounded. The absence of emotional charge made them easier, not harder. Distance had done what years of effort never could. It clarified the limits of what we were capable of being to each other. The family that had once gathered to declare my ending never gathered again in the same way. There was no reunion, no reckoning, no apology tour. Life moved forward unevenly, carrying everyone where their choices led. Some paths narrowed, others widened. Mine opened. I began to notice how differently people responded to me now. Not with expectation, but with respect. Not with assumption, but with curiosity. I no longer felt the need to earn my place in rooms I entered. I belonged there because I chose to be. That belonging was internal before it was ever external. One evening, as I walked home through streets lit softly by early dusk, I thought back to the moment I had walked out of that house with my suitcase in hand. The certainty in my son's voice, the quiet satisfaction in my husband's, the confidence of people who believed they had orchestrated an ending. They had been wrong, not because I punished them, not because I retaliated, but because I refused to return to a life that required me to disappear in order to function. Silence had been my exit, not my defeat. Walking away had not turned their lives into a living hell. It had simply removed the illusion that someone else would always absorb the consequences of their decisions. Once that illusion was gone, reality did what it always does. It asserted itself. As for me, I built something better. Not louder, not harsher, better. A life where my presence was chosen, not assumed. A life where my value was inherent, not transactional. A life where peace was not negotiated at my expense. And if there was one truth that carried me forward with unwavering clarity, it was this. My time was never over. I had simply stopped spending it on people who believed it was theirs to end. They thought my silence was weakness, that walking away meant I had nothing left to give. What they never understood was that silence is what you choose when you're done explaining yourself to people who have already decided not to listen. I didn't destroy their lives. I simply stopped protecting them from the consequences of their choices. And in that space, where I finally chose myself, I didn't lose a family. I gained my life back, intact, unashamed, and no longer waiting for permission to exist.